It's 1:30 in the morning in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, 20 miles north of the city of Philadelphia. Joseph Lear is at a bus stop waiting for a ride from his friend Christian. And Christian, who is normally incredibly reliable, just isn't showing up. So now Mr. Lear takes a cab to Christian's house with every intention of giving Christian a piece of his mind as to why he left him abandoned at 1:30 in the morning. All the lights are off. It looks as if nobody's there. What's going on? He steps into this house in the dark. Mr. Lear turns around and sees that the interior of this place looks like a bomb went off in it. He instinctively knows that something is very wrong indeed, and it frightens him.
Christian?
He begins to search the home. He pushes the bathroom door open.
Oh my God, Christian!
And staggers backwards because he is stricken.
I'm Detective Chris McMullen. I work for the Bensalem Police Department. In 2005, I was a detective in the Criminal Investigations Division. It was in the middle of the night. A headquarters call woke me up. Whenever there's a homicide, they call everybody in. So I take a deep breath and know that it's going to be a long night. In this particular case, I went right to the crime scene. There was marked patrol cars there. Nobody can go in, nobody can go out.
McMullen is informed that there's a 27-year-old individual no longer alive whose name is Christian Rojas.
Christian was from Costa Rica. He had grown up there. He went to a gifted high school, and he had become a skilled web designer and computer expert. One of the reasons he was in the United States was to work for a computer firm.
When you enter a crime scene, you don't want to disturb anything. I was always taught the first thing you do is put your hands in your pocket so you don't screw anything up by touching it. I entered the living room, and it was obvious to me that there had been some type of ransacking. Cushions were ripped open, furniture was moved, everything was out of place.
This is not the usual burglary. This place has been destroyed. Whoever was in here was convinced there was something of great value to them concealed somewhere in this house. And they tore the place apart to find it.
I saw a photograph that was originally on the wall. It was broken, and it had 3 people in it, 2 men and a woman. It was determined that the decedent was one of the 2 men in that photograph.
It's interesting that this photograph has been purposely destroyed. Is that something that speaks to emotion, where someone is so angry they break the picture? Or is it because people hide things in picture frames as well?
As I started walking towards the bathroom, I'm seeing some blood on the walls, some on the carpet.
So this begins in the hallway. The victim is being savagely assaulted and retreating toward the bathroom to avoid the attack. When McMullen pushes open that bathroom door, he smells an unmistakable smell that you never, ever forget. The smell of death.
I remember seeing the victim in the bathtub, and I thought to myself, Who could do this to somebody? It was an awful, terrible crime scene. The tub was filled with water, but the water was black, and there was a pillow over the face of the decedent. He had had a sock stuffed in his mouth, socks wrapped around his neck.
McMullen notices the imprint of a human face in blood on the ceramic wall of the bathtub. This is very, very violent.
I remember thinking that this poor individual did not die a quick death. It seemed to me that he had been beaten and tortured. It just made it very evident to me that this person more than likely knew who it was who attacked them, and that there was some type of emotional anger, motivation behind it. In the water, there was just various condoms floating. They had been removed from a box and thrown into the water, almost like a symbolic gesture.
McMullen's mind drifts back to that crushed photograph.
The condoms reinforced my thinking that maybe the two men in the photograph both had an interest in the female, and maybe this had to do with jealousy and had gotten way out of hand.
The level of violence indicates personal motivation. It says emotion. And emotion often comes from love interrupted. McMullen thinks about this based on his own experience. You have evidence of home invasion, evidence of a robbery, evidence of search for valuables and or narcotics. But then you have overkill in the bathroom. It's like a mixture of potential motives. Very difficult to say whether this is all about the search and all about the failure of the search, or is it about, I hate you because you've been involved with my girlfriend? So he's left with this state of confusion.
Hey, Richie, where's the guy that called us in? Oh, he's right over there.
McMullen interviews Joseph Lear right away. He knows that he's got to start with the first person that found the body.
He was very nervous. He was running on adrenaline. He had probably experienced the most terrifying thing that he had ever gone through in his life.
What can you tell us about Christian?
He was one of my best friends.
Joseph Lear and Christian met in Costa Rica at some point. Ben Salem was the Lear's hometown, and when Christian relocated to the United States, he suggested that Christian come there.
Even though he had only been in the United States a few years, Christian did well with people. He was an affable person, someone that people wanted to be around, and he was also very much in touch with his family still.
He had family back in Costa Rica, a mother and a couple sisters. He would send them most of his money, so he lived very modestly.
Mr. Lear can't imagine Mr. Rojas having an enemy in the world. Mr. Rojas has never used narcotics, has no criminal record, which McMullen confirms. He is your everyday, innocent person carrying on a career in the United States.
When I showed Joseph Lear the photograph that had Christian and the other couple in it, he told me that that was Mark Russo and his wife, Sarah.
He reports that they used to live together. They were roommates with Christian Rojas, but Christian moved out. The question becomes, under what circumstances did Christian move out?
I had this thought go through my mind that, is this some type of a love triangle?
Then the question becomes in McMullen's mind, well, who loves who? The old expression is certainly true in affairs of the heart. Two's company and three is a crowd. Was Christian the crowd, or was he part of the company? And somebody decided it was time for him to go away permanently. – 27-year-old Christian Rojas is found murdered in his home in Ben Salem, Pennsylvania. Detective McMullen believes there might be, a love triangle at the basis of this crime.
At this point, we wanted to find out about Mark Russo and his wife, Sarah. But before I was able to even obtain contact information from Mark Russo, he actually showed up at the police station on his own.
Did Russo present himself because he's fishing for information from the police about what they know or what they may suspect? Or is he just concerned about his friend? McMullen considers those 2 points.
Sometimes people show up with good intentions. Also, sometimes people show up because they want to interject themselves into the investigation. We needed to speak with him and find out where he was and what he knew.
So, how exactly did Christian come to live with you and your wife?
Well, we actually met in Costa Rica.
He explained that he had actually helped Christian find work here in the United States. He did live with him and his wife, although him and his wife weren't married at the time, but their relationship was blooming, and in a gesture to allow them their privacy, Christian then moved out and got his own place.
Mark pointed out it wasn't acrimonious. They remained friends after this.
I asked Mark, did Christian ever have any type of attraction to your wife, or was there anything like that going on? And he said, absolutely not. He was not concerned about that. And just like Joe Lear, he seemed to be sincerely upset and blown away by what had happened.
McMullen finds him to be quite believable. So Mr. Russo is out as a suspect.
With any homicide, you want to learn the victimology. So we wanted to know about, did he have any roommates? Was he in a relationship? Where did he work?
Anybody like a girlfriend?
Well, he does have an ex.
Mark told us about a girl named Heather that Christian had been involved with.
He was under the impression it was over, though about a week earlier, the girl had reached out to Christian.
She needed a place to stay. And Mr. Russo said that Christian was a warm-hearted, caring person, and he would not allow anyone to suffer because of his unwillingness to take care of them. So he allowed her to stay with him in the very recent past.
Well, that added something new to what we were looking at. I wanted to find out what Heather's last name was, and when was the last time he saw her.
I only met her once or twice, but I can ask around. By the way, what'd you guys do with Christian's car?
Russo said, I had this old car, green in color, that had a lot of miles on it, and Christian didn't have a car, so I gave it to him.
The car was not anywhere to be found in the apartment complex where Christian lived. So at that point, the car was missing.
Where is it? The only place it could be is in the hands of a murderer.
Knowing that there was a car involved and that the car was now missing was huge. That then led us to believe, okay, if we can find the car, then maybe we can find the killer.
So McMullen puts out this description of this vehicle stolen in the course of a homicide. So if any policeman anywhere sees this car in motion, they're going to stop the car and arrest the contents.
In the meantime, we're looking for clues. We're looking to link things together.
Often at a crime scene, you can't clearly see a body. The lighting isn't very good. The position of the body obstructs certain wounds. So it has to be done in a coroner's office under bright light.
The rate of decomposition showed that Christian was probably dead for approximately 2 days before he was discovered.
It's a horrible situation. The victim suffered enormously during the course of his demise. He had lacerations and head wounds from being bludgeoned with a blunt instrument of some type. He'd either been knee dropped or kicked in the chest with a serious bruise on the sternum.
There were other injuries to his body, but they were just methods of torture. What had caused Christian's death was actually blunt force trauma and asphyxiation.
The coroner says that the knot of the tube sock around the neck was sufficient to restrict the air supply. The victim had bitten through his lip with his teeth, struggling to get air in his system.
There were no defensive wounds noted on Christian's body at the autopsy, indicating that whoever had attacked him had immediately overpowered him and that there wasn't much of a contest.
So McMullen believes he's probably looking for somebody quite a bit bigger than Rojas to be able to control him, to attack him in the manner in which he was attacked. Who would do this?
Christian's family was in Costa Rica, and obviously word had gotten to them, and they were devastated. For me, the driving force is always the victim, getting justice for the victim and their families. So in this case, it was all about Christian.
Well, I've known Detective McMullen for 28 years. He doesn't stop. He'll keep drilling down and drilling, and if he gets assigned to your case, chances are you're not going to be able to run from it.
Any hits on Christian's car? Nothing yet, but these phones have been ringing all morning.
Word travels quickly. It had gotten out in the community that somebody had been murdered in their home, and that police had yet to identify and/or apprehend the suspects.
Detective McMullen.
This is a scary crime that has happened in a suburban town. People are reacting to it. They were horrified.
In Bención, our crime that we're dealing with is mainly thefts and property crime, burglaries. We don't get a lot of homicides. If we get half a dozen homicides a year, that's a lot for us.
This was about the 4th homicide that I've been involved with since I'd become a detective. So there's definitely pressure. There's pressure from the boss.
McMullen and his department are overwhelmed by a number of tips that are meaningless and somewhat nonsensical from people who are in panic mode. Oh my God, the violence has entered Ben Salem, because it's never been true before. The community's reacting to their fear level is what's happening, and they're creating these false people who may be murderers all over the place.
When tips come in, I mean, we have to look into them, and if they're good tips, obviously, then they're helpful to us. Sometimes the problem is you get inundated with them, and if a lot of them really don't have any value, you still have to look into them, and it takes up time and manpower and resources.
But one tip does come in that has some value.
I've been contacted by a journalist for the Bucks County Courier-Times. He had received an email from a gentleman who is a friend of Christian Rojas.
Check out this email I just got.
The email went on to explain that Christian Rojas had recently been offered a dream job in Costa Rica for an American company who had relocated there. The writer of the email goes on to say that Rojas's current employer was very distressed about Rojas leaving his employment.
Christian had told this person that his employers had the ability to do bad things and that he was somewhat frightened of them.
At first, the information that Christian's employers would want him dead seems a little far-fetched. But for McMullen, there was a catch.
Christian Rojas worked for a cash advance company run by Anthony and Mario Moretti. And having done a little bit of research on them, it was verified their father had some mafia ties.
Now that raises McMullen's eyebrow.
If there was a connection like that, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to think that if Christian was leaving the company under bad terms, that something may have escalated to violence.
The next step is obvious. Who are these brothers? They're either part of this or they're not, and McMullen has to find the answer to it. Many leads have come forward, none of which have much value, but now McMullen is pursuing a new lead that may have some meaning. Two brothers that might be connected to the Italian mafia in the city of Philadelphia and South Jersey.
Police say the victim has strong ties to organized crime.
Throughout the city's history, there has been organized crime, theft, racketeering, gambling.
Police this afternoon combed the shooting scene at 6th and Catherine for evidence.
Connected with a number of different families. The Scarfo family was a particular family that was very involved.
Now, in 2005, the Italian mafia was a mere shadow of its former self. That doesn't make them any less dangerous. They remain more than capable of extreme violence.
Well, now we're wondering, did they have something to do with this? So we contacted them by phone and made arrangements to go and visit them at their office. I'm trying to determine whether or not they have any type of anger towards Christian, but they seem to be fond of Christian.
They both say Christian Rojas was an incredibly competent computer programmer, that Rojas was their go-to guy to solve problems when they encountered them in the business.
How did you guys feel about Christian leaving the company?
They were obviously not happy about that, but they liked him so well that they wouldn't stand in his way.
They seemed sincere in the fact that they wanted him to succeed. They seemed legitimately distraught over what had happened. We were able to verify their alibis. They were all home at their respective residences.
Despite their connections to nefarious people, they're not involved in this.
They definitely wanted the crime solved. They made that very clear. They offered their resources. They really wanted to take an active role in what was going on.
Did they take the safe?
Wait a minute, what's safe?
And they told us that he had a safe that he kept cash in. He would cash his paycheck and then convert it to money orders to send home to his family in Costa Rica.
McMullen was certainly aware that there was no safe found in Christian Rojas's house. Somebody took it. Someone who knew it was there.
At this point, McMullen is starting to get some answers, but he really doesn't have a full-fledged suspect yet.
There's a safe that was stolen and his car is missing. So at this point, it's a robbery and a homicide. We've spoken with everybody and we're satisfied with those people and what they've had to tell us. But there's still his ex-girlfriend, Heather, and at this point, she's the only wild card because we don't know where she is. We don't have a last name for her.
Later that afternoon, McMullen's partner says we looked over the answering machine that Christian had in his house, and we discovered these messages. You need to listen to these because it's really kind of interesting.
Christian, please, I don't know what else to do. You said you would help me. I need your help really badly, please.
The first one was Heather, and she was distraught. She was crying.
Why won't you please talk to me? I really, really need to talk to you. Please answer the phone.
The next message was from Heather again.
Christian, call me the back now.
But her demeanor had gone from distraught to angry.
Heather's statements certainly put a different light on how you look at her.
After hearing those messages, it started to make me think that it's possible that she could have been involved with this homicide.
She would certainly know his habits. She would certainly know about a safe. Who is she?
So the next day, Mark Russo did get back to me, and he told me that he was able to get her full name, and she was identified as Heather Lavelle. We went into our master names index, and we pulled a photo of her.
She's 36 years of age. She's very tall, natural blonde, considered to be very attractive.
We had learned that she was a very educated person, and there was a time that she had a very good paying job in the insurance industry.
She was in an assistant vice president position making well over $140,000 a year.
So here is a college graduate, tall and lovely, making very good money, who all of a sudden has to stay with Christian Rojas because she's fallen on hard times. How could that be true?
Upon doing an inquiry on her name, it was discovered that recently Heather Lavelle had been arrested for possession of drug paraphernalia. Unfortunately, due to addictions, she had lost her job and lost her home.
People who become involved in depression, in losing their way, believe that drugs are the magic that will make that all go away. The difficulty is, it is magic, but it's black magic, and it will destroy you every single time.
Aside from the arrest for the drug paraphernalia, there was also a domestic disturbance. It showed that Heather Lavelle had been in a fight with her boyfriend, James Savage. She just basically wanted to get her belongings and leave.
But after police showed up, she decided not to pursue any further charges, despite signs there had been physical violence.
We started to compile background information on James Savage, and we learned that he did have a criminal history. In fact, he had a violent criminal history.
Savage is a widower, but there's a report from his wife that he had threatened her with a rifle, and she had obtained a protection from abuse order against him.
He was a big guy. He's a physically intimidating guy. He's about 6'4", well over 250 pounds.
Given the violence from the crime scene, it was likely somebody with a lot of force, an ability to exert that force on another person. Savage matched that description.
So McMillan says, okay, Heather's fallen on hard times, and she asked Christian if she can stay there because of this issue between her and her current boyfriend. What if her current boyfriend misunderstands that and doesn't believe that Christian Rojas is offering help, but he's somehow re-involved with his girlfriend?
We got the address of James Savage from the police report and went to that residence in an attempt to make contact with him.
Can I help you?
We're looking for James Savage.
We are met by his mother, Jackie Savage. She told us that her son wasn't there. She verified that he was having a relationship with Heather Lavelle and that he told her that they were going to go to the shore for the weekend.
Jackie tells police that the last time she saw them, they were unloading some of Heather's belongings out of Jackie's car, and they're transferring it over to a different car.
What kind of car?
She says to Detective McMillan, they were in a small green car. I'd never seen that car before.
I didn't think Heather had a car.
Oh, really? Well, my. Now, isn't that interesting?
As far as we're concerned, they're most likely driving Christian's car, which means that they're connected to the homicide.
There's always a moment in a criminal investigation. It's a moment of euphoria. When somebody says something that means nothing to them and means everything to you. Everything.
You said they were heading to the shore. Which shore?
He didn't specifically say where, he just said to the shore.
Ben, Salem, Pennsylvania is very close to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Delaware coast, to the Maryland coast, North Carolina, Virginia. It could be anywhere, really.
Do you mind giving your son a call for us?
Okay.
Do you mind if we come in while you make that call?
Oh, sure.
When people kill, they are in an emotional state like they've never been in their lives. They're desperate. They don't know what to do. They just want to run. What are you going to do, James? You're going to go to the shore? You're going to swim to Europe? Is that your plan?
Hello?
Jimmy.
What?
What's going on? You told me, that you were going to the shore. Are you all right?
Are the police looking for me?
Yeah.
Can you wire me money?
I don't know where you are to do that. Maybe you should call and talk to the cops.
No.
And tell them what's going on.
No.
Maybe she can call.
What are you talking? Who can call?
Heather.
Why? She don't want to talk to me either.
He didn't say anything about coming home or coming back. He had made mention that she may never see him again.
I love you. I don't know what's going on, son. If you guys are in trouble, then you need to talk to the cops or something to find out.
No, we can't talk to the cops. Can you wire me any money or not?
Where?
Bye.
It seemed as though, from the context of the short phone call, that they were on the run. They seemed desperate for money. There was concerns as to what they were going to do next.
Savage is in desperation mode. He's violent, he's a drug addict, and now he's scared. What's he capable of? Anything.
We wanted to find James Savage, and at the same time, we were worried about Heather's safety because it wasn't clear to us what her role in this was. Did he use her to get into Christian's apartment? Did he force her to flee with him? So at that point, we decided we wanted to track the cell phone used by James Savage.
They ping the locations on that cell phone, comes back to the Delaware coast.
We have no reason to believe they have friends or relatives there where they could stay, so we decided to start checking local hotels. There was one hotel that was checked, and
manager, she provides them with a registration form and says that Savage was accompanied by a tall, blonde girl who said nothing during the registration process. They check the surveillance footage, and there is James Savage and Heather Lavelle.
Exterior video cameras from the same establishment showed them getting into a green car and leaving, which is the car that we believe belonged to Christian. We asked if we could go inside the room, and according to the hotel staff, the room had not even been cleaned yet.
In the hotel room, there are stained towels, red and black.
It appeared as though somebody had dyed their hair in a very quick manner without cleaning up afterwards. I don't think that people just hit the road and just abruptly dye their hair color for no real reason at all.
They alert law enforcement they're still in the suspect vehicle somewhere on this coastal highway, and that they are now changed their hair color. Police publicize these photographs of these two individuals to be placed in the evening news and newspapers.
The next day, there was a call on the line from the police in Nags Head, North Carolina. They had located the green car that we were looking for.
They make a traffic stop. As the officer steps out of his car to approach them, they take off. He gets back in the car and pulls on a high-speed pursuit, close to 100 miles an hour down this highway. They are coming south, and they are smoking.
During this chase, the police employed stop sticks. It's something that you roll out in front of a fleeing vehicle, and when the car goes over it, it punctures the tires.
And they run through it in that small green car and shred the tires off the rims, and the car grinds to a stop in the ditch.
Both the driver and the passenger got out and ran in two separate directions.
Now the chase is on. Only this time it's on foot. Desperation causes this behavior. You are terror-stricken. You're not thinking clearly. You're thinking, feet don't fail me now. Detective McMullen's two primary suspects have been pursued by the police in Nags Head, North Carolina.
Please! Show me your hands! Go, go, go.
They refused to stop, and it turned into a long, drawn-out pursuit.
Police!
The reality is, when you run from the police, you're not going to escape. You're just going to be very tired and soaking wet when you get arrested. Why go through the exhaustion? Turn around and put up your hands.
Ultimately, they were both apprehended by officers. Our next step was we have to get down to Nags Head. So we made travel arrangements pretty quickly. The first thing we did, we had gotten a search warrant for the car, and we found clothing that we believed belonged to Christian. It had blood on it. We found a set of brass knuckles, and those brass knuckles also had blood on them.
So we have a trail of evidence that comes out of Christian Rojas's house into the trunk of the car being driven by James Savage and his companion Heather Lavelle. Yet another nail in their respective coffins.
We talked to James first. He's a big, scary guy. And you could tell he was just mad at the world. And having seen what he had done, it was unnerving to be seated next to him. We told him, look, we're down here to talk to you about Christian Rojas. We know that you were there. We know that you were involved.
I may have been there, but it was these other dudes.
He said that he and Heather had been at Christian's house and that 3 other people came in and did a home invasion robbery, and that he and Heather barely got out. So he basically told us a story to try and see if we would buy that. We asked him, so why did you steal Christian's car? And he's like, well, we just grabbed the first set of keys we could and we wanted to get away. You know, obviously they had taken the time to pack that car and we knew that.
Savage is just puking lies, said McMullen. He just can't stop.
Want to smoke?
McMullen doesn't want Savage to see him as an enemy. He wants Savage to calm himself to some degree.
We brought up Heather. We asked him, did something bad happen between Heather and Christian that you were upset about? And he started to talk to us when we approached it that way.
I just went over there to talk to the guy.
James Savage had a jealousy issue with Christian due to the relationship that Heather had had with him.
He says there's an exchange of words between he and Christian, and a fight breaks out.
He said Christian picked up a set of brass knuckles. He got really angry about that and disarmed Christian and then really started to assault him in a very violent manner.
Savage says Christian Rojas becomes unconscious. So he and Heather leave. And when they return, they find him dead in the bathtub. Oh my God, how could this have happened?
He said, so we tried to make the whole thing look like a robbery by tying up his body after he was already dead.
It's a preposterous story to try to explain away his lack of involvement in this crime. So ultimately, despite his attempt at lying profusely, he's incriminating himself in the death of Christian Rojas.
So if James Savage wasn't going to be truthful, maybe Heather would be truthful to us. We want to hear her account of what happened. One of the first things we said to her was, we said, are you okay? Did he force you to come down here?
No.
I'm not under any duress, was the words that she used. It made me believe that she could have been a willing participant in this homicide.
Tell us about your relationship with Christian.
It didn't last very long, maybe about a month.
She had told us that for a while he was pretty happy with her, but then when he realized that she had a drug problem, he had to let her go. We talked about her fall from grace, how at one time she was doing really well. And once she started smoking crack cocaine, there was no turning back. She would beg, borrow, and steal to get money to buy drugs.
So when Heather broke up with Christian Rojas, she goes and finds another boyfriend. When drug users find another person like themselves who has the same taste for narcotics, there is no limit to what they will do. They will take their grandmother's rings off her fingers when grandma is in her coffin if they can convert it into money to feed their habit.
After James Savage and Heather Lavelle had that domestic dispute, Heather left James. She had nowhere to go, and she wound up going back to Christian and asking him for help, and he let her in.
Heather knew that she could go to Christian because Christian was kind, Christian was loving, Christian cared about people.
But then you went back to James.
Yeah.
Because, of course, she still needs narcotics. You have to help me. I need more drugs. Then she tells Savage about Christian, and she also tells him he has a safe in his house.
It was starting to become clear to us that Heather was the brains behind this. Heather still had a key to Christian's house.
They wanted drug money, and Christian was the potential source.
They found a safe and broke it open. They found like $40.
What the hell is this?
Now they're angry because they wanted to have a good score and they didn't get it. So they waited for him to arrive home.
What are you doing here? What the hell is going on here?
Where's the money, Christian?
When he arrived home, her and James confronted him.
Answer her!
I just sent some money home, okay? Everything that's left is in the safe, okay?
He's lying.
James is in a jealous rage and immediately sparks fly.
Where is it?
I swear, I'm not lying, no!
The fight between Christian and James was like David and Goliath. There was no contest.
You got the money somewhere! I swear!
Heather was very paranoid that somebody was going to hear them. At some point, she took a sock and jammed it into his throat.
Christian's last moments were terrifying.
James threw the condoms in the bathtub because he was angry that Heather and Christian had slept together. It proved that jealousy was definitely a factor in this murder. In a panic, they tried to make the whole thing look like a robbery.
Heather knew exactly what she was doing. She was the architect of the scheme.
She brought Savage into Christian's house, and she enabled everything to happen. As far as I'm concerned, she is absolutely as guilty as Savage of killing Christian.
Both James Savage and Heather Lavelle were extradited back to Pennsylvania.
They were charged with homicide and related offenses. They were originally facing the death penalty. However, the trial never occurred because both of them pled guilty.
They both were sentenced to life in prison, where they remain to this day.
I was just happy that the case was resolved and that they were convicted and going to jail, and they were never going to be in society again where they could give in to their demons of addiction and hurt anybody again.
McMullen is like any other detective in the United States. Anywhere, really. You are faced with a plate full of spaghetti, tangled in a gigantic knot. Your job is to unravel that knot. And McMullen did precisely that. He unraveled it carefully and slowly and technically to where this is the result. The people responsible, life in prison. It's how it's supposed to work. It's how it does work. Because of detectives like Detective McMullen.
I did get to meet Christian's family. And they were there when the sentence was actually imposed.
There are places in the world where silence feels sacred. A cathedral before sunrise. A snow-covered forest. A library where every whisper carries the weight of respect. And then there is a neonatal intensive care unit, where silence means something entirely different. It is never complete. It breathes. It pulses. It is interrupted every few seconds by the soft rhythm of heart monitors, the measured hiss of ventilators, the tiny clicking sounds of infusion pumps delivering medicine drop by drop into bodies no bigger than a parent's forearm. Here, life does not announce itself with loud cries or dramatic gestures. It survives in numbers glowing green across dark screens. It survives in oxygen saturation levels that climb 1 percentage point at a time. It survives in hands that have learned to move with impossible precision around patients who weigh less than a bag of sugar. Parents who step into such a ward quickly learn that hope has its own language. They stop measuring time in days or weeks. Instead, they count every stable heartbeat, every successful feeding, every hour without an alarm. Every sunrise their child lives to see becomes a victory that outsiders can barely comprehend. A nurse's reassuring smile can become the strongest medicine in the room. A doctor's quiet nod can erase an entire night of fear. Trust is not simply offered inside these walls. It becomes the invisible structure holding exhausted families together. Among the faces that walked these brightly lit corridors was a young nurse who appeared to embody that trust. She smiled easily. She volunteered for extra shifts. She sent thoughtful messages to colleagues after difficult days. Parents remembered her gentle voice and calm presence beside incubators surrounded by wires and transparent tubes. To many, she looked exactly like the kind of person anyone would want caring for the smallest and most vulnerable patients imaginable. No one entering that hospital could have imagined that, years later, the name Lucy Letby would become known around the world. Her face would appear on newspaper front pages across continents. Television networks would interrupt regular programming to report courtroom developments. Medical experts, statisticians, lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens would spend years arguing over one extraordinary question. Had one neonatal nurse deliberately harmed babies entrusted to her care, or had a catastrophic combination of tragic medical outcomes and circumstantial evidence created one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern British history? Before courtrooms filled with legal arguments, before investigators assembled thousands of pages of medical records, before headlines divided public opinion, there were only babies. Tiny babies. Children born too early. Children whose fingers were scarcely wider than a wedding ring. Children whose parents had already endured weeks of uncertainty before hearing the words every family longs for. They're stable. For some families, those words lasted only hours. For others, only minutes. Then, without warning, monitors erupted into urgent alarms. Nurses rushed toward incubators. Doctors abandoned nearby patients and sprinted across the ward. Parents watched through glass windows, unable to understand why a baby who had seemed to be improving only moments earlier was suddenly surrounded by frantic medical staff performing desperate attempts at resuscitation. Some infants recovered. Others never opened their eyes again. In a hospital, death is an unfortunate reality, especially inside a unit dedicated to premature babies whose lives begin with extraordinary medical challenges. Every doctor working in neonatal medicine understands that not every child can be saved. Even with modern technology, even with experienced specialists, nature sometimes proves stronger than medicine. But medicine is also built upon patterns. When patterns change, someone eventually notices. At first, nobody wanted to believe anything unusual was happening. A single tragic loss could be explained. Then another. Then another. The staff comforted grieving parents. They completed reports. They attended funerals. They returned to work because more babies needed them. Still, something felt different. Some infants had been making encouraging progress. Some collapses appeared astonishingly sudden. Some deaths resisted the explanations that usually accompanied the heartbreaking realities of neonatal medicine. Questions emerged quietly. Not accusations. Not suspicions of murder. Just questions. Why had this baby deteriorated so rapidly? Why did another infant collapse despite showing signs of recovery only hours earlier? Why were experienced consultants struggling to understand what they were seeing? Hospitals are places where professionals constantly challenge one another's assumptions. Medicine depends upon skepticism. Doctors review scans twice. Nurses verify medication dosages. Specialists ask uncomfortable questions because mistakes can cost lives. Those questions gradually expanded beyond individual cases. Consultants began reviewing patient records together. They searched for medical explanations that might connect the seemingly unrelated tragedies. Infection, equipment failure, a hidden environmental factor, a previously unidentified complication affecting premature infants. Every possibility had to be explored before anything else. Yet the deeper they looked, the stranger the picture appeared. One detail surfaced repeatedly. It was not proof. It was not a diagnosis. It was simply an observation. The same nurse seemed to be present more often than anyone expected. Coincidences happen. Hospitals operate around rotating shifts. Dedicated nurses often volunteer for additional hours. A hardworking employee naturally appears in more medical records than someone working fewer shifts. No responsible physician could accuse a colleague based upon coincidence alone. So they kept looking. The observations became discussions. The discussions became meetings. The meetings became disagreements. Some senior clinicians believed immediate action was necessary. Others feared an innocent nurse could be destroyed by suspicion unsupported by direct evidence. Hospital administrators found themselves facing an almost unimaginable possibility. If the concerns proved unfounded, they would have unjustly accused a member of staff devoted to caring for critically ill babies. If the concerns proved justified, every day of hesitation carried consequences too painful to contemplate. Outside the hospital, life continued without interruption. Parents pushed strollers through parks. Children laughed on school playgrounds. People hurried to work beneath ordinary grey English skies. Few realized that inside one neonatal unit, a quiet conflict was unfolding between uncertainty and urgency, between professional caution and growing alarm. Years later, when police investigators entered the story, they would not discover a crime scene marked by shattered windows or blood-stained floors. Instead, they encountered something far more difficult. Medical charts. Medication records. Laboratory results. Shift schedules. Electronic messages between colleagues. Handwritten notes. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary-looking documents that, according to prosecutors, concealed an extraordinary pattern. According to the defense, those same documents reflected the tragic complexity of neonatal medicine rather than intentional violence. That distinction would become one of the defining battlegrounds of the entire case. Unlike many notorious criminal investigations, this story offered no dramatic confession delivered under interrogation. No surveillance footage capturing a fatal act. No eyewitness who could stand before a jury and say, "I saw exactly what happened." Instead, nearly every important conclusion would depend upon interpretation. Medical interpretation. Statistical interpretation. Behavioral interpretation. Legal interpretation. Even today, long after convictions were returned and whole-life prison sentences imposed, debate continues among some medical professionals, statisticians, and legal scholars regarding aspects of the evidence presented at trial. Those ongoing debates have not overturned the verdicts, which remain in force, but they have ensured that this case continues to attract extraordinary scrutiny from people seeking to understand not only what happened inside one hospital, but also how modern justice evaluates highly technical medical evidence. Perhaps that is what makes this story so unsettling. It is not merely a story about life and death. It is a story about trust. About how fragile trust becomes once doubt enters a room. About parents who believed their children were in the safest hands possible. About doctors forced to question colleagues they had worked beside for years. About investigators attempting to reconstruct events that unfolded in moments invisible to everyone except the people standing at an incubator. And about a legal process asked to answer questions that medicine itself could not resolve with absolute certainty. Before the headlines, before the verdicts, before the controversy that would spread far beyond the walls of one hospital, there were families dreaming of taking their newborns home. Most had already imagined the first photograph in the nursery. The first birthday. The first steps. The first words. Instead, many found themselves planning funerals for children who had scarcely begun to live. That is where this story truly begins. Not with a suspect. Not with an investigation. But with a place built to protect the most vulnerable lives, and with a series of tragedies that slowly transformed one ordinary hospital into the center of one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern British history, morning arrives differently inside a neonatal unit. Outside, the city of Chester wakes in familiar ways. Delivery vans roll across damp streets. Shopkeepers unlock their doors. Commuters clutch paper cups of coffee against the cool English air. The cathedral bells drift across rooftops, unnoticed by most people rushing through another ordinary weekday. But beyond the brick walls of the Countess of Chester Hospital, time follows another rhythm entirely. There is no true sunrise inside the unit. The lights never really go out. The air remains carefully controlled, warm enough to protect infants whose bodies cannot regulate temperature on their own. Transparent incubators stand in neat rows beneath fluorescent lighting that washes every surface in sterile white. Curtains separate families from one another, but grief and hope ignore those barriers. They travel freely from bed to bed. Every parent who enters carries the same invisible burden: fear. Some have spent months preparing for a healthy delivery only to find themselves watching doctors race their newborn into intensive care minutes after birth. Others arrive after emergency cesarean sections that blurred together into flashes of bright operating lights, hurried voices, and consent forms signed with trembling hands. Nothing prepares them for their first encounter with the machines. Tiny chests rising and falling beneath adhesive sensors. Breathing tubes. Feeding tubes. Intravenous lines secured with strips of carefully placed tape. A heartbeat displayed as moving green peaks across black monitors. Parents quickly learn to read those numbers even though nobody ever teaches them how. 95. 97. 99. Good. Then 88. The alarm sounds. Everyone in the room stops breathing for a fraction of a second before a nurse reaches the bedside with practiced confidence, adjusting a tube, checking a line, offering calm reassurance that sometimes the monitor reacts faster than the baby's body. Eventually, mothers and fathers begin to recognize the nurses by voice before they recognize them by face. Some speak softly. Some joke gently to ease impossible tension. Some explain every procedure in careful detail. Others simply stand beside frightened parents without saying much at all, understanding that silence can sometimes be the greatest comfort. Trust grows in small moments. A blanket tucked around an incubator. A hand resting briefly on a father's shoulder. A photograph taken because exhausted parents are too afraid to leave their baby's bedside for even a few minutes. These gestures rarely appear in medical records. They remain instead in memory. For many families, those memories would later become painfully complicated. Because among the dedicated professionals working inside that neonatal unit was a nurse whose name would eventually eclipse every other detail of the hospital itself. Before the investigations. Before the arrests. Before the courtroom sketches. Lucy Letby appeared, to many people around her, remarkably ordinary. She had trained as a children's nurse and later specialized in neonatal care, a field demanding patience, technical precision, and emotional resilience. Colleagues described someone willing to take additional shifts. Friends saw photographs of holidays, birthday celebrations, and ordinary evenings spent with family. Social media reflected a life that looked reassuringly familiar, filled with smiling faces and everyday moments that blended into thousands of similar lives across Britain. Nothing about those images hinted that her future would become the subject of documentaries, newspaper investigations, academic debate, and international headlines. Nothing suggested that prosecutors would one day accuse her of committing some of the most disturbing crimes imaginable within the very place parents believed was safest. But stories like this are dangerous when told only through hindsight. Knowing how the story ends tempts us to imagine that warning signs must have been obvious from the beginning. They rarely are. Real life almost never announces itself like fiction. No dramatic music accompanies ordinary conversations. No ominous shadow follows someone through hospital corridors. No one wakes one morning sensing they are standing at the beginning of history. Most days simply feel like work. Doctors review laboratory results. Nurses administer medication. Parents ask whether today's scan looks better than yesterday's. Cleaning staff disinfect every surface with relentless consistency because invisible bacteria pose constant threats to fragile immune systems. Life continues through routine. Routine creates safety. Safety creates confidence. And confidence makes it difficult to imagine that anything extraordinary could be unfolding unnoticed. That is why the earliest concerns emerged so cautiously. Not from detectives. Not from journalists. But from clinicians trying to understand medicine. One baby suffered an unexpected collapse. The team fought to stabilize the infant. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. Medicine demands that every unexpected outcome be examined carefully, especially when dealing with critically ill newborns. Doctors reviewed scans, blood tests, medication charts, and treatment decisions. They searched for explanations grounded in science because science is the language hospitals speak. Then another unexplained deterioration occurred. Different child. Different family. Different day. Yet something about the event seemed strangely familiar. Not identical. Just familiar enough to leave experienced consultants unsettled. Experienced neonatal physicians spend decades learning the countless ways premature infants can deteriorate. Infection. Respiratory complications. Congenital abnormalities. Internal bleeding. Organ failure. Tragedy, while heartbreaking, is not unexpected. Mystery is. Gradually, conversations began extending beyond individual patients. Could these events somehow be connected? Was there an environmental factor affecting multiple babies? Was equipment malfunctioning intermittently? Could an undetected infection be spreading despite every precaution? Each possibility carried frightening implications. Each demanded investigation. No responsible clinician leaps immediately toward the most shocking explanation. Medicine moves carefully because lives depend upon accuracy rather than instinct. So meetings were held. Patient records were compared. Clinical decisions were reviewed. Experts challenged one another's conclusions. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Outside those meeting rooms, parents remained almost entirely unaware of the growing uncertainty. They continued placing faith in the people wearing blue uniforms and identification badges. Faith is an extraordinary thing inside a hospital. Families surrender control because they have no alternative. When your child weighs less than a kilogram, you cannot negotiate with physiology. You cannot bargain with premature lungs. You cannot will tiny organs into maturity. You trust strangers. You trust that every syringe contains exactly the right medication. You trust that every alarm will be answered immediately. You trust that everyone standing beside your child shares the same purpose. Protect life. That trust forms the emotional center of this story. Because once trust fractures, everything else changes. Every smile becomes open to interpretation. Every conversation acquires new meaning. Every memory is revisited through the lens of what came later. Parents who once remembered kindness begin wondering whether they overlooked something. Doctors replay emergency resuscitations in their minds, searching for details that seemed insignificant at the time. Nurses question their own observations. Administrators examine decisions that once appeared routine. Memory itself becomes unreliable, reshaped by knowledge that did not exist when those moments originally unfolded. Investigators would eventually face the same challenge. Unlike detectives investigating a shooting or a robbery, they could not simply reconstruct a sequence of obvious physical events. Their evidence lived inside hospital systems. Shift patterns. Medication logs. Blood chemistry. Laboratory analyses. Digital records documenting minute-by-minute clinical observations. Thousands of entries recorded not because anyone anticipated a criminal investigation, but because meticulous documentation forms the backbone of modern healthcare. Each record told only a fragment of a much larger story. No single document answered the central question. Together, prosecutors argued, they revealed a disturbing pattern. The defense argued something equally important. Patterns can emerge naturally within complex medical environments. Correlation does not automatically establish criminal responsibility. Statistical coincidence, rare disease processes, staffing shortages, and the inherent unpredictability of neonatal intensive care all demanded careful consideration before reaching irreversible conclusions. Those competing interpretations would eventually define one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent British history. Yet none of that existed during the earliest days. Back then, there was only uncertainty. Doctors attempting to solve medical puzzles. Families praying for miracles. A hospital balancing compassion with relentless clinical discipline. And somewhere within that ordinary routine, according to the prosecution's case, a series of deliberate acts remained hidden behind the appearance of normal hospital life. Whether viewed as the exposure of an extraordinarily rare serial offender or as a case that continues to generate debate about the interpretation of complex medical evidence, one fact remains beyond dispute. The families at the center of this story experienced devastating losses that forever divided their lives into two chapters. Before the hospital. After the hospital. Everything that follows, the investigation, the courtroom battles, the forensic arguments. The international attention begins with those families and the fragile hope they carried through the doors of a neonatal intensive care unit, believing they were entering a place where every possible effort would be made to help their children survive. The events that unfolded there would challenge not only individuals and institutions, but also society's understanding of trust, evidence, medicine, and justice in ways that continue to resonate long after the verdicts were delivered. The story you are about to hear has been examined from almost every possible angle. Police investigators spent years assembling evidence. Medical experts dissected clinical records line by line. Prosecutors argued that a devastating pattern pointed toward deliberate harm. Defense lawyers challenged those conclusions, arguing that complex medicine, imperfect hospital systems, and interpretation, not criminal intent, could explain what happened. A jury heard months of testimony before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts, and the courts imposed whole life sentences. At the same time, in the years that followed, some clinicians, statisticians, and legal scholars publicly questioned aspects of the evidence and the reasoning used during the trial. Those discussions continue, and the convictions remain in force while legal review processes continue. That complexity is not a footnote to this case. It is part of the case itself. Because this is not the kind of story where every question ends with absolute certainty. It is a story built from fragments. A handwritten note discovered in a house years after the events it appeared to describe. Electronic messages exchanged between colleagues after long hospital shifts. Medical observations entered into computer systems in the middle of chaotic emergencies. Parents trying to remember the last smile they saw from their child. Doctors trying to recall precisely who stood beside an incubator during a collapse that lasted only minutes but has occupied their memories for years. Police officers attempting to reconstruct moments that left almost no traditional forensic evidence behind. Unlike many famous criminal investigations, there was no abandoned weapon lying at the scene. No security camera recording every movement. No stranger fleeing into the darkness. If crimes occurred, the prosecution argued, they occurred in one of the most controlled environments imaginable, surrounded by professionals whose attention was focused not on searching for criminal behavior but on saving critically ill babies. That difference changes everything. A hospital is designed to preserve life, not investigate homicide. When an alarm sounds in a neonatal intensive care unit, nobody pauses to consider whether a crime might be unfolding. They run. Every instinct pushes doctors and nurses toward treatment. Compress the chest. Check the airway. Increase oxygen. Call for help. Prepare emergency medication. Every second belongs to the child. Only later, if the child cannot be saved, does anyone begin asking why. That sequence would become critically important. Because by the time larger questions emerged, countless moments had already passed into history. The memories remained. The paperwork remained. The grief remained. But the moments themselves were gone forever. Imagine standing inside a room where every decision is measured in seconds. An incubator door swings open. Several pairs of gloved hands move almost simultaneously. One clinician watches the monitor. Another adjusts the breathing tube. Someone records vital signs. Someone else prepares medication. Parents wait outside, staring through glass, unable to hear the conversation unfolding around their child. Inside that room, nobody thinks they are creating evidence for a future murder trial. They believe they are fighting death. Months later, years later, those same medical notes would be projected onto courtroom screens. Every abbreviation, every timestamp, every signature. Lawyers would ask witnesses to explain decisions made during extraordinary pressure. Experts would disagree over laboratory values. Specialists would debate whether an unexpected collapse could be explained naturally or whether it suggested external interference. Jurors, ordinary citizens without decades of neonatal experience, would be asked to evaluate some of the most technically complex medical testimony ever presented in a criminal court. The weight of that responsibility is difficult to overstate. Because every conclusion carried consequences that could never truly be reversed. If the prosecution's case was correct, innocent babies had been deliberately harmed by someone entrusted with protecting them. If significant errors existed in the interpretation of the evidence, then the justice system itself faced profound questions about how it evaluates highly specialized medical cases. Those possibilities are dramatically different. Yet they occupied the same courtroom. The same evidence. The same witnesses. The same legal process. Perhaps that is why this case has never faded quietly into history. Even after the verdicts, discussion did not end. It evolved. Medical journals published analyses. Legal commentators revisited key pieces of evidence. Statisticians examined how patterns were interpreted. Journalists produced lengthy investigations attempting to understand not only what happened inside one hospital but also how such an extraordinary case came to dominate public attention. For the families whose children were at the center of these proceedings, however, academic debate could never restore what had been lost. Their lives had already divided into before and after. Before the emergency call. Before the doctor entered the consultation room. Before they heard words no parent ever expects to hear. After that, calendars lost their ordinary meaning. Birthdays became anniversaries of absence. Nurseries became silent rooms. Photographs became priceless. For some parents, there were no first steps to record. No first words. No school photographs. Only memories measured in days, or sometimes in hours. It is impossible to understand this case without remembering that reality. Courtrooms often reduce lives into exhibits. Baby A. Baby B. Baby C. Letters replacing names to protect identities. Clinical records replacing personalities. Legal arguments replacing lullabies. Necessary for justice. Necessary for privacy. Yet behind every letter stood a family who had imagined an entire lifetime. A first Christmas. A first bicycle. A first day at school. A graduation. A wedding. The ordinary milestones that people rarely appreciate until they disappear. Those futures never arrived. Whether viewed through the lens of prosecution or defense, that loss remains undeniable. As this story unfolds, it will be tempting to search immediately for answers. To identify heroes. To identify villains. To decide where certainty begins and uncertainty ends. Real investigations rarely offer that comfort. Instead, they demand patience. The smallest detail, a timestamp, a laboratory result, a forgotten conversation, can suddenly reshape everything believed before. Some clues grow stronger over time. Others weaken. Some assumptions collapse entirely. Others survive years of scrutiny. That is why we will move carefully. Not because the story lacks drama. Quite the opposite. It is because the truth, or at least the closest reconstruction human beings can reach, deserves more than dramatic shortcuts. It deserves context. It deserves precision. It deserves an understanding of the extraordinary pressures inside neonatal medicine, where life and death often exist only a heartbeat apart. Only by understanding that world can we begin to understand why experienced clinicians first noticed something they could not explain, why investigators eventually became involved, why one nurse came to stand trial for multiple murders and attempted murders, and why. Despite convictions that remain legally in effect, discussion about aspects of the evidence continues years later. Everything that follows grows from those unanswered questions. Questions born not in darkness or abandoned alleyways, but beneath bright hospital lights. Questions whispered first in staff meetings rather than police stations. Questions that slowly escaped the walls of one hospital and spread across Britain, then across the world. Because once trust is questioned in a place built entirely upon trust, the consequences reach far beyond a single building. They reach every parent who has ever placed a newborn into the hands of a nurse. They reach every doctor whose decisions may later be judged through hindsight. They reach every investigator asked to distinguish tragedy from crime. And they reach every society that must decide how justice should function when certainty is elusive, evidence is highly technical, and the stakes could not possibly be higher. This is not simply the story of one woman. It is the story of vulnerable lives, devastated families, determined investigators, divided expert opinion, and a criminal case whose impact continues to echo long after the courtroom doors first closed. In the chapters ahead, we return to the beginning, not to the headlines, but to the hospital itself, where ordinary days slowly, almost imperceptibly, gave way to extraordinary questions that would change countless lives forever. Chester is the kind of city that rarely appears in international headlines for tragedy. Resting near England's border with Wales, it carries the quiet confidence of a place that has learned to preserve its history without becoming trapped by it. Ancient Roman walls still encircle much of the old city. Narrow streets weave between black and white timber buildings that have stood through centuries of wars, plagues, and political upheaval. Tourists arrive to admire the cathedral, stroll along the River Dee, and lose themselves beneath the famous Rose, where medieval architecture coexists with modern cafes and boutiques. It is a city that seems to move at a gentler pace than larger metropolitan centers, where familiar faces are common and routine offers comfort rather than monotony. For most residents, the Countess of Chester Hospital represented exactly what every community hopes for in its local healthcare system. Reliable. Professional. Close enough to reach in an emergency. People arrived there every day carrying every imaginable emotion. Some entered through the maternity ward anticipating the happiest day of their lives. Others rushed through the emergency department after sudden accidents or frightening diagnoses. Most eventually returned home with stories of compassionate nurses, reassuring consultants, and ordinary acts of kindness that never appeared in newspapers because they were simply part of the job. Hospitals often exist as invisible pillars within a community. People notice them most when they need them. Until that moment arrives, they remain comforting landmarks rather than places of personal significance. For expectant parents, however, the maternity department occupies an entirely different place in their imagination. Months before a child is born, they picture the first cry, the first embrace, the first photograph, the drive home with a newborn sleeping quietly in a carefully installed car seat. Very few parents imagine that instead of decorating a nursery, they will spend weeks learning medical terminology they never expected to hear. Apnea, bradycardia, ventilator support, oxygen saturation, parenteral nutrition. Terms that quickly replace conversations about baby clothes and bedtime stories. Inside the neonatal unit, every family arrived carrying a different story. Some pregnancies had progressed normally until unexpected complications during labor forced emergency deliveries weeks before the due date. Others had been marked by months of uncertainty, repeated scans, specialist consultations, and cautious optimism. Premature birth is not a single experience. It is hundreds of different journeys converging in the same place. Some babies weigh barely 500 grams. Others struggle with immature lungs incapable of delivering enough oxygen to sustain life without assistance. Some require surgery almost immediately after birth. Others simply need time for tiny organs to complete work that nature intended to finish inside the womb. Every incubator contains not only a child but an entire future suspended between possibility and uncertainty. Parents learn astonishing lessons within days. How to place a fingertip gently against impossibly delicate skin. How to change a diaper through the circular openings of an incubator. How to celebrate gains measured in grams rather than kilograms. How to distinguish between the ordinary beeping of medical equipment and alarms demanding immediate attention. Above all, they learn patience. Nothing moves quickly in neonatal medicine. Progress often arrives so gradually that only nurses notice it. A baby tolerates a slightly larger feeding. A ventilator setting is reduced by one small increment. The infant opens both eyes for a few seconds longer than yesterday. These moments become milestones. Entire families celebrate achievements that most people never realize exist. The neonatal unit itself was not a place of chaos. On the contrary, it functioned through routine. Every shift began with detailed handovers. One nurse carefully transferred responsibility to another, discussing medication schedules, feeding plans, laboratory results, and any subtle changes observed during the previous hours. Nothing was considered too small to mention. A slight change in breathing. A different skin color. An unusual response to feeding. Medicine values detail because detail saves lives. Doctors moved methodically between incubators, reviewing charts and adjusting treatment plans. Respiratory therapists checked ventilators with practiced precision. Laboratory staff processed blood samples around the clock. Pharmacists verified medications that would be administered in doses measured in fractions of milliliters. Behind every surviving premature infant stood dozens of professionals performing hundreds of tasks invisible to the families they served. It was a world built upon cooperation. No single individual could care for these babies alone. Each decision depended upon communication. Each procedure required trust. Each successful outcome reflected teamwork more than individual achievement. That culture shaped everyone working within the unit. New nurses learned not only technical skills but also emotional discipline. Some days ended with celebrations. A baby finally breathing independently. Parents holding their child without assistance for the first time. A discharge home after months of intensive care. Other days ended in silence. Staff members removed gloves slowly. They completed documentation no one wanted to write. They spoke quietly with families whose lives had changed forever. Then they returned to work because another infant still needed medication, another parent still needed reassurance, another emergency could arrive at any moment. The emotional demands of neonatal nursing are difficult to exaggerate. Professionals working in such environments learn to balance compassion with composure. Too much emotional distance risks making patients feel like clinical cases rather than human beings. Too much emotional involvement risks overwhelming the caregiver. Finding that balance requires years of experience. Many nurses describe their colleagues as a second family because few people outside the profession fully understand what they witness every day. Long shifts blur together. Meals are interrupted by emergencies. Birthdays, holidays, and weekends often disappear beneath rotating schedules. Yet despite the exhaustion, many remain because they believe deeply in the purpose of the work. Helping a child survive offers a reward impossible to measure financially. It is within this environment that Lucy Letby built her career. She was not an outsider entering an unfamiliar system. She belonged to it. Having trained as a children's nurse before specializing in neonatal care, she became part of the everyday rhythm of the ward. Colleagues saw someone who appeared dedicated to the profession. She accepted additional shifts, maintained friendships within the hospital, and participated in the routines that define life inside healthcare institutions. To families meeting her for the first time, She appeared no different from countless other neonatal nurses across Britain, calm, attentive, and confident around critically ill infants. That image would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Because extraordinary criminal cases often encourage the public to search backward for obvious warning signs. People imagine sinister behavior hidden in plain sight. A cold stare. A cruel remark. A history of violence. Reality is frequently far less dramatic. Many individuals later interviewed about their interactions with Letby described encounters that appeared entirely ordinary at the time. Some remembered kindness. Others remembered professionalism. Several parents expressed gratitude for care they believed had been compassionate during unimaginably difficult moments. Those memories would later become painfully conflicted after the allegations emerged, forcing families to reconsider experiences they had once associated with comfort. Memory is complicated. It changes when new information arrives. The same smile can appear reassuring one year and unsettling the next, depending on what people later come to believe. That is why investigators are often cautious about relying solely on retrospective impressions. People naturally reinterpret the past through the knowledge of the present. During 2015, however, none of those future questions existed. The ward continued operating as it always had. Babies were admitted. Some recovered quickly enough to move into lower dependency care. Others required prolonged treatment. Sadly, some died despite every effort made by medical teams. Every neonatal unit experiences loss. The staff understood that reality better than anyone. Premature infants are among the most medically vulnerable patients in the world. Even advanced neonatal medicine cannot guarantee survival. Death, while devastating, is not itself evidence that something has gone wrong. That truth formed the foundation of every clinical decision. It also explains why the earliest events attracted little immediate suspicion. A single unexpected collapse could be explained by the unpredictable nature of neonatal medicine. Even two tragic outcomes occurring close together might still fall within the painful realities faced by intensive care units. Patterns reveal themselves only over time. And time, in medicine, often moves quietly before anyone realizes that something unusual may be unfolding. In those early months, no one imagined that routine clinical discussions would eventually evolve into one of the most scrutinized criminal investigations in modern British history. The hospital remained what it had always appeared to be, a place where vulnerable children fought for survival, where exhausted families searched for hope, and where dedicated professionals believed that every new shift offered another chance to bring a fragile life safely home. If you stood at the entrance to the neonatal unit during an ordinary afternoon in 2015, nothing would have suggested that history was quietly taking shape behind its secured doors. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic, a scent familiar to anyone who has spent time inside a modern hospital. Footsteps echoed softly against polished floors before disappearing beneath the constant mechanical chorus of monitors and ventilators. Staff members passed one another with quick smiles, clipped conversations, and cups of coffee that were often forgotten before they had the chance to cool. Shift changes arrived with practiced efficiency. One team left after 12 demanding hours. Another stepped in, already prepared to carry the responsibility forward. There was comfort in repetition. Medication rounds happened at scheduled times. Blood samples were collected with extraordinary care. Parents received updates throughout the day, sometimes encouraging, sometimes heartbreaking, but always delivered with the understanding that honesty and compassion had to exist together. For families, the neonatal intensive care unit became an entire universe compressed into a handful of rooms. Outside, seasons continued to change. Leaves fell from trees lining the streets of Chester. Rain swept across the city in long grey curtains. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows. None of it seemed particularly important anymore. The only calendar that mattered hung beside an incubator. The only clock worth watching was the one measuring the next feeding, the next scan, the next consultation with the doctors. Parents developed routines almost without realizing it. They learned which chair was most comfortable beside their baby's cot. They knew where to buy coffee at 3 o'clock in the morning. They memorized the shortest route from the maternity ward to intensive care. Some read children's books aloud to babies too small to understand the words, believing that familiar voices might somehow encourage tiny hearts to keep fighting. Others placed handwritten cards beside incubators, decorating otherwise clinical surroundings with promises of birthdays yet to come. "We'll take you to the beach. Your grandparents can't wait to meet you. Your big brother already loves you." Tiny messages filled with enormous hope. Many nurses understood how important those gestures were. Medicine could stabilize a body. Hope stabilized a family. The best neonatal professionals knew they cared for both. They answered medical questions patiently, but they also noticed when a father had not eaten for hours or when a mother quietly cried after everyone else had left the room. Sometimes care meant adjusting a ventilator. Sometimes it meant making tea. Sometimes it meant standing silently beside parents who had run out of words. Among hospital staff, these moments rarely received recognition. There were no awards for sitting beside a grieving family after midnight. No newspaper stories about the nurse who stayed 10 extra minutes because anxious parents needed reassurance before going home to sleep. Compassion was simply expected. It became part of the profession's identity. Like many healthcare workers, Lucy Letby appeared to fit naturally within that environment. She had built friendships with colleagues through years of demanding work. Photographs taken during staff gatherings showed smiling faces celebrating birthdays, charity events, and holidays. Conversations extended beyond medicine into ordinary life, vacation plans, home renovations, family news, favorite television programs. The hospital was not merely a workplace. For many employees, it became a community. Shared experiences created unusually strong bonds. Few professions expose people so regularly to moments of profound joy and devastating grief. A healthy baby finally going home after months in intensive care could leave an entire ward smiling. The death of another infant only days later could silence those same corridors. Healthcare workers learned to carry both emotions simultaneously. That emotional resilience often impressed outsiders. But resilience comes at a cost. Long hours. Night shifts. Sleep deprivation. Repeated exposure to trauma. The pressure of making decisions where mistakes can carry irreversible consequences. Every experienced clinician understands that fatigue is not simply physical. It accumulates emotionally. Some carry it home. Others bury it beneath routine. Some convince themselves they have grown accustomed to loss. Few truly do. The neonatal unit also operated within the broader realities facing Britain's National Health Service. Demand frequently exceeded resources. Hospitals managed staffing shortages, financial pressures, and increasing patient needs while striving to maintain the highest standards of care. Those systemic challenges were neither unique to Chester nor evidence of wrongdoing. They formed part of the everyday environment in which doctors and nurses worked across the country. Busy shifts often required flexibility. Staff volunteered for additional hours. Schedules changed at short notice. Experienced nurses sometimes cared for multiple critically ill infants simultaneously. Against that backdrop, it was not unusual for dedicated employees to appear frequently on shift rotas. Someone willing to cover extra work naturally appeared more often in patient records. That fact would later become significant not because it proved anything by itself, but because it became one element in a much larger argument presented years afterward. At the time, however, it attracted little attention. Administrators viewed extra availability as commitment. Colleagues appreciated reliable teammates. Parents rarely noticed staffing patterns at all. They focused entirely on the tiny person lying inside the incubator. Every conversation eventually returned to one question. Is my baby getting better? Sometimes the answer was encouraging. Blood oxygen levels had improved. The lungs looked stronger. The infant tolerated feeding more successfully than yesterday. Each small improvement represented another step toward home. Families celebrated milestones invisible to the outside world. The removal of a breathing tube. The first successful bottle feed. The moment a parent finally held their baby against their chest without layers of medical equipment separating them. Skin-to-skin contact became more than a medical practice. It became proof that hope remained alive. Doctors often encouraged these moments because research suggested they benefited both infants and parents. Mothers closed their eyes as they listened to tiny heartbeats. Fathers who had spent weeks feeling powerless finally experienced the simple act of holding their own child. In those quiet moments, intensive care almost resembled ordinary parenthood. Then another monitor would sound. Another emergency would begin. Reality returned immediately. No one inside the neonatal unit ever forgot how fragile these lives were. A baby who appeared stable in the morning could deteriorate unexpectedly by evening. Medicine accepted uncertainty because biology rarely followed predictable schedules. That uncertainty shaped every clinical decision. Every medication required careful calculation. Every procedure demanded caution. Every change in condition prompted discussion among experienced professionals. It was precisely because unexpected deterioration was already part of neonatal medicine that the earliest incidents failed to trigger immediate suspicion. When one infant collapsed, staff responded exactly as they had been trained. They searched for medical explanations. When another child experienced a similar crisis weeks later, they again looked first toward disease processes, complications of prematurity, or rare physiological events. Criminal intent occupied no one's mind. Hospitals are built upon the assumption that everyone inside shares the same purpose: saving lives. Without that assumption, healthcare could scarcely function. Trust binds every member of a clinical team together. Doctors trust nurses to administer medications accurately. Nurses trust laboratory results. Parents trust every professional entering the room. That trust is not naive. It is essential. Destroy it, and the entire system begins to fracture. Years later, many observers would ask a painful question. How could concerns have taken so long to emerge? The answer lies partly within the culture of medicine itself. Extraordinary accusations demand extraordinary evidence. Doctors are trained to avoid conclusions unsupported by data. Professional disagreements occur constantly, but accusing a colleague of intentionally harming patients is among the gravest allegations imaginable. No responsible clinician reaches such a conclusion lightly. Before considering anything so shocking, every natural explanation must first be exhausted. Equipment failure. Unexpected infection. Previously unrecognized medical complications. Errors in treatment. Statistical coincidence. Each possibility deserves careful examination because each is more common than the deliberate harming of patients. This cautious approach protects both patients and healthcare professionals. It also means that truly unusual events may not immediately appear extraordinary. Only when separate tragedies begin forming a broader pattern do difficult questions gradually emerge. At first, those questions remained confined to clinical discussions. Consultants compared notes. Medical records received closer review. Conversations became longer. Some clinicians felt increasingly uneasy about the number and nature of sudden collapses they had witnessed. Others believed the events, while deeply distressing, could still be explained within the unpredictable realities of neonatal intensive care. No one yet possessed a complete picture. Pieces existed. The puzzle did not. Not until more time passed. Not until more records accumulated. Not until experienced professionals, looking back across months rather than days, began noticing details that seemed impossible to ignore. Even then, uncertainty remained the dominant emotion. Not certainty. Not accusation. Uncertainty. It is one of the defining features of this case that so much of what followed began not with dramatic revelations but with careful observation, disagreement, and the slow, methodical attempt to distinguish coincidence from pattern. That process would eventually draw in hospital administrators, outside experts, detectives, and ultimately a jury. But during these early months, The neonatal unit still appeared, from the outside, to be exactly what every family believed it was, a place where dedicated professionals worked tirelessly against impossible odds, hoping that tomorrow's shift would bring one more child safely back from the edge of life. Every institution has a memory. Not the kind preserved in official reports or archived meeting minutes, but the quiet memory carried by the people who walk its corridors every day. It exists in habits, routines, shared experiences, and unspoken understandings. A hospital remembers through its staff. Nurses remember which consultant remains calm during the most difficult emergencies. Junior doctors remember the senior clinician whose advice has guided them through countless sleepless nights. Porters remember which departments never seem to slow down. Even the walls begin to feel familiar after enough years, as though every room has absorbed the stories unfolding within it. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was no different. Long before it became known around the world, it was simply another department trying to provide the best possible care with the resources available. Successes far outnumbered tragedies. Babies who had once fit inside the palms of their parents' hands eventually returned months later as smiling toddlers, carried proudly through the ward by grateful mothers and fathers eager to introduce the healthy children they had once feared they might lose. Those visits meant everything to the staff. For nurses, they served as reminders that the exhausting night shifts, the emotional strain, and the relentless attention to detail were worthwhile. A child running across the ward years after surviving premature birth represented something far greater than a happy reunion. It represented hope made visible. Photographs from former patients sometimes decorated staff areas. Thank you cards accumulated over time, written in different handwriting but carrying remarkably similar messages. Parents thanked doctors for refusing to give up. They thanked nurses for treating their children as though they were family. They thanked receptionists who remembered their names, healthcare assistants who offered blankets during long nights, cleaners who quietly kept rooms spotless without interrupting precious moments between parents and babies. Healthcare is often remembered through extraordinary acts. In reality, it is sustained by thousands of ordinary ones. A nurse checking an infusion pump one more time before leaving a room. A doctor reviewing blood results again because something feels slightly unusual. A colleague agreeing to stay late because another emergency has arrived. Tiny decisions, repeated every day, create the invisible foundation upon which patient safety depends. That foundation is built on one principle above all others: trust. Without trust, no hospital can function. A consultant cannot personally verify every medication administered across an entire ward. A nurse cannot independently perform every laboratory analysis. Each professional depends upon the accuracy, honesty, and competence of everyone else. Parents, meanwhile, trust all of them simultaneously. It is perhaps the greatest act of faith most people will ever make. Handing over a child who cannot speak. A child who cannot explain pain. A child entirely dependent upon strangers. Most parents never think about that trust because they have no reason to question it. And most healthcare professionals spend entire careers proving that trust is justified. This broader context matters because it explains why the allegations that would later emerge seemed almost unimaginable to many people. The idea that someone working within such a system could deliberately exploit that trust challenged assumptions extending far beyond one hospital. It forced uncomfortable questions upon the public. How well do we truly know the people caring for our loved ones? Can ordinary appearances conceal extraordinary actions? And if something deeply unusual does occur inside a hospital, how quickly can anyone recognize it? Those questions have no easy answers. They never have. History contains rare examples of healthcare professionals convicted of harming patients, but those cases are exceptional precisely because they are so uncommon. The overwhelming majority of doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers dedicate their lives to protecting others, often at considerable personal sacrifice. That reality must remain central to understanding this story. The allegations against one individual should never become a lens through which every healthcare professional is viewed. Inside the neonatal unit, however, broader philosophical questions remained far from anyone's mind. Life continued according to the needs of the babies. One infant required respiratory support. Another struggled to maintain body temperature. A third finally gained enough weight to reduce intensive interventions. Every shift demanded complete concentration because conditions could change within moments. Experienced nurses often developed an almost instinctive awareness of their patients. They noticed subtle differences invisible to less experienced observers. A baby's breathing sounded slightly different. Skin tone changed almost imperceptibly. Movement became weaker than expected. These observations rarely attracted attention outside medicine, yet they often prompted early interventions that prevented far more serious complications. Such expertise develops only through years of practice. It cannot be replaced by machines alone. Technology provides information. Human judgment gives that information meaning. That balance between technology and experience would later become an important feature of the investigation. Medical records documented what happened. Experts were asked to interpret why. The distinction proved crucial. Numbers alone cannot explain every event inside an intensive care unit. They require context, clinical judgment, experience, sometimes even disagreement. Medicine advances precisely because professionals challenge one another's interpretations in pursuit of more accurate understanding. By the middle of 2015, subtle concerns had begun surfacing among some senior clinicians. Not public concerns. Not accusations. Private professional discussions. Certain collapses appeared unusually sudden. Some babies had seemed to be progressing in ways that made their rapid deterioration difficult to explain. Individually, each event might still have fallen within the unpredictable realities of neonatal medicine. Collectively, they began creating a sense of unease that was difficult to articulate. Unease is an unusual emotion in science. Scientists prefer evidence. Doctors prefer diagnoses. Hospitals prefer certainty whenever possible. Yet there are moments when experienced professionals recognize that something feels wrong before they possess sufficient information to explain why. Those moments demand caution. They also demand humility. An instinct unsupported by evidence can easily become a false conclusion. An instinct ignored entirely can allow important problems to continue unnoticed. Finding the balance between those possibilities is one of the greatest challenges in clinical practice. As more unexpected incidents accumulated, conversations among some consultants became increasingly focused. Patient records were revisited. Timelines were compared. Possible medical explanations were debated in detail. No single observation answered every question. Instead, multiple fragments gradually began forming a picture that some clinicians believed required closer scrutiny. Others remained unconvinced. The disagreement itself reflected responsible medical practice. Extraordinary claims should be examined rigorously before they are accepted. No one wanted to believe that deliberate harm could be occurring. Indeed, many found the very suggestion almost impossible to contemplate. The hospital administration also faced difficult responsibilities. Any concern involving patient safety demanded careful consideration. At the same time, any allegation against a member of staff carried profound consequences for that individual's career, reputation, and personal life. Moving too quickly risked injustice. Moving too slowly risked something even worse if the concerns proved justified. These competing obligations created an atmosphere of increasing tension beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary hospital routine. From the perspective of families, nothing had visibly changed. Doctors still conducted ward rounds. Nurses still smiled reassuringly. Machines continued their steady rhythm. Hope and fear continued existing side by side inside every room. Few parents could have imagined that behind staffroom doors, experienced clinicians were beginning to ask questions unlike any they had faced before. Those questions would eventually leave the hospital. They would reach police investigators. They would become the foundation of one of the longest and most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern Britain. But that future remained unseen. For now, there were only conversations. Quiet conversations. Careful conversations. Conversations shaped by uncertainty rather than certainty. Because before anyone investigates a crime, before detectives arrive with evidence bags and search warrants, someone must first recognize that what appears to be a tragedy may require a different explanation. That recognition does not happen all at once. It develops gradually. One unexplained event. Then another. A meeting. Another review. A growing feeling that the answers everyone expected to find were refusing to appear. That was the atmosphere slowly settling over the neonatal unit. Not panic. Not suspicion. Not yet. Only the uncomfortable realization that some questions were becoming harder to dismiss than before. In hindsight, those early conversations would be viewed as the first faint ripple before a wave that would ultimately reshape countless lives. At the time, however, they were simply the careful deliberations of experienced medical professionals trying to understand a series of devastating events without allowing emotion to outrun evidence. None of them could know that the decisions made over the coming months would eventually lead beyond hospital corridors and into police headquarters, courtrooms, and an international debate about medicine, justice, and the extraordinary difficulty of distinguishing tragic coincidence from deliberate criminal acts. Before this story became known through court transcripts, expert testimony, and newspaper headlines, it existed in a far quieter form. It existed as nursery walls waiting to be painted, as unopened boxes of baby clothes stacked carefully in spare bedrooms, as ultrasound photographs tucked inside wallets and pinned to refrigerator doors, as names whispered between parents late at night, spoken over and over until they felt real enough to belong to the tiny lives that had not yet entered the world. Every child at the center of this case was someone's long-awaited future. Some pregnancies had followed years of hope, disappointment, and renewed determination. Others had unfolded with joyful anticipation until complications arrived without warning, transforming ordinary prenatal appointments into urgent consultations with specialists. No matter how different their journeys had been, every family carried the same quiet expectation that one day they would leave the hospital together. That expectation was so ordinary it hardly seemed worth questioning. Parents discussed which grandparent the baby might resemble. They argued playfully over bedtime routines that were still months away. They imagined first birthdays, first Christmas mornings, first words spoken across living room floors scattered with toys. Like millions of families before them, they believed the difficult part would be sleepless nights and diaper changes. Instead, many found themselves learning a completely different vocabulary. Prematurity. Respiratory distress. Intravenous nutrition. Brain ultrasound. Blood gas analysis. Words they had never expected to hear suddenly became part of everyday conversation. The babies in this story were extraordinarily small, but they occupied enormous spaces in the hearts of their families. One infant might weigh less than a kilogram yet already be the center of an entire family's universe. A father who had always imagined teaching his son to ride a bicycle now stood silently beside an incubator, celebrating a gain of 20 grams. A mother who had dreamed about carrying her newborn through the front door instead learned how to place a single finger inside an incubator so her baby could curl tiny fingers around it. Grandparents waited anxiously by telephones, desperate for updates. Brothers and sisters asked innocent questions that adults struggled to answer. When can the baby come home? Soon, everyone hoped. Soon. Hope became the emotional currency of the neonatal unit. It existed in every conversation. Doctors offered cautious optimism when they could. Nurses celebrated each small improvement because they understood how much those moments meant. Parents learned not to measure progress by weeks but by tiny victories almost invisible to anyone outside intensive care. A successful feeding. A stable night. A reduction in oxygen support. An extra hour without alarms. The outside world often imagines survival as a dramatic event. Inside neonatal medicine, survival is usually slow. Painfully slow. It arrives through hundreds of small successes accumulated one after another. Families quickly adapted to that reality. They memorized the sounds of the machines surrounding their children. Each monitor developed its own familiar rhythm. Each alarm carried a different meaning. Some required immediate intervention. Others simply reminded staff that a sensor had shifted slightly against delicate skin. Eventually, parents stopped flinching at every beep. They learned to look first at the faces of the nurses. If the nurses remained calm, they tried to remain calm too. Trust grew naturally from those shared days and nights. Many parents later described the staff as becoming almost like extended family. Birthdays passed inside hospital rooms. Anniversaries were celebrated beside incubators. Some mothers were discharged from the maternity ward while their babies remained behind, creating one of the most emotionally difficult moments imaginable. Walking out of the hospital without your child feels fundamentally wrong. Yet countless parents of premature infants experience exactly that. Every morning they returned. Every evening they reluctantly left again. Their lives became measured by visiting hours and medical updates. The neonatal unit became home in every way except one. Their baby could not yet leave. For some families, those weeks brought encouraging news. The breathing tube was removed. Feeds increased. Weight climbed steadily. Doctors began discussing eventual discharge. Parents allowed themselves to imagine ordinary life again. The nursery waiting at home. The first walk in a stroller. Friends finally meeting the newest member of the family. These dreams were not extravagant. They were beautifully ordinary. That is precisely what made them so precious. Other families remained trapped in uncertainty. Progress one day. Setback the next. Every improvement seemed balanced by another obstacle. Premature babies often follow unpredictable paths, and experienced clinicians repeatedly reminded parents that recovery was rarely a straight line. Good days could be followed by frightening nights. Stable weeks could end with unexpected complications. Hope required resilience. No one understood that better than the families themselves. Among the babies later discussed in court were children identified publicly only by letters rather than names. This anonymity was intended to protect the privacy and dignity of the surviving children and the families of those who died. Behind each letter, however, stood a unique story. Each baby had parents with different dreams, different fears, different photographs stored on mobile phones, different lullabies whispered beside incubators. The legal process necessarily transformed individual lives into structured evidence. Baby A. Baby B. Baby C. But outside the courtroom, they were never letters. They were beloved sons. Beloved daughters. Children whose parents could already picture the futures unfolding before them. One father carefully documented every milestone, believing he would one day show those memories to a teenager curious about the difficult beginning of life. One mother spent hours reading stories aloud, convinced her child recognized the familiar sound of her voice despite the maze of tubes and monitors. Another family took photographs almost every day, not because remarkable changes occurred from morning to evening, but because they feared missing even the smallest moment of progress. Tiny expressions. Tiny movements. Tiny victories. Everything mattered. The nurses understood this instinct. Many encouraged parents to participate as much as possible in their baby's care. Changing nappies. Helping with feeding when appropriate. Providing skin-to-skin contact. Talking softly during quiet moments. Medicine could treat the body. Family nurtured the spirit. Even for babies too young to remember those experiences consciously, such moments carried profound emotional importance for their parents. The atmosphere inside the neonatal unit often reflected cautious optimism. Not blind optimism. Experienced optimism. Doctors never promised outcomes they could not guarantee. Instead, they explained risks honestly while emphasizing each encouraging sign. Parents became experts in reading expressions. A consultant entering the room with a relaxed smile eased anxieties before speaking a single word. A hurried conversation between clinicians could immediately tighten every muscle in a mother's body. Life inside intensive care sharpened emotional awareness. Every glance seemed meaningful. Every pause carried weight. Yet despite the uncertainty, families continued believing in tomorrow. Tomorrow's blood test might look better. Tomorrow's scan might bring reassuring news. Tomorrow the ventilator settings might be reduced again. Tomorrow the baby might finally open both eyes. Tomorrow remained the most hopeful word in the entire ward. None of these families knew that years later, strangers around the world would read about fragments of their lives through court judgments and media reports. They could not imagine that their private tragedies would become subjects of documentaries, legal analysis, and public debate. At that moment, they were simply mothers and fathers doing everything parents have always done, loving children they had only just met, believing that every difficult day brought them one step closer to carrying them safely home. That quiet hope, so deeply human and so universally understood, would become the emotional heart of everything that followed. For parents of premature babies, love quickly becomes inseparable from routine. Every morning begins with a telephone call before the journey to the hospital. How was the night? Did anything change? Was there any progress? The answers are often brief because the nurses have dozens of patients requiring their attention, yet every word carries enormous weight. Stable. Comfortable. No major concerns. Those simple phrases can transform an anxious drive into one filled with cautious relief. Inside the neonatal unit, parents gradually stop noticing the things that once seemed frightening. The maze of wires no longer dominates their attention. The transparent incubator no longer feels like a barrier but a temporary home protecting the child they desperately want to hold. Medical equipment becomes familiar. The strange language of intensive care becomes almost conversational. A doctor mentions blood gases. A nurse discusses oxygen saturation. A consultant explains feeding tolerance. Within weeks, mothers and fathers who had never set foot inside an intensive care unit begin understanding conversations they could never have imagined having before their child was born. They do not choose to learn. They learn because love leaves them no alternative. Many families decorate the small spaces surrounding their babies in subtle ways. A knitted blanket made by a grandmother. A tiny stuffed animal placed where hospital policy allows. A handwritten card with a simple message. We love you. Keep fighting. We're right here. These objects have almost no medical importance. Emotionally, they mean everything. They remind exhausted parents that beyond the tubes and monitors lies the ordinary childhood they still believe awaits their son or daughter. The nurses often notice these details. Some quietly reposition family photographs after cleaning the incubator. Others remember the names of grandparents, older siblings, even family pets mentioned during casual conversations. Such gestures help transform an intensely clinical environment into something that feels, however briefly, more human. Parents remember those moments long after they forget medication names or oxygen settings. Because kindness is easier to remember than technical language. This is why hospitals occupy such a unique place in people's lives. Most institutions provide a service. Hospitals become part of family history. Years later, people rarely remember the exact date of a laboratory test. They remember the nurse who sat beside them after devastating news. They remember the doctor who celebrated the first successful feeding as though it were a personal triumph. They remember the healthcare assistant who found an extra chair because neither parent wanted to leave the bedside. Those memories shape how families carry grief and gratitude long after the medical details have faded. For many of the families later connected to this case, those ordinary acts of compassion existed alongside unimaginable heartbreak. That coexistence makes their stories especially difficult to tell. Because life inside the neonatal unit was never defined by tragedy alone. There was laughter. There were moments of genuine optimism. There were babies who recovered and eventually went home. The ward remained a place dedicated to saving lives. That truth is essential. Without it, the story risks becoming distorted. It is easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to imagine every day inside the unit as overshadowed by future events. Reality was far more complicated. Most shifts ended without catastrophe. Most treatments proceeded exactly as expected. Most staff members went home believing they had done everything possible for the children entrusted to their care. Only gradually did certain cases begin standing apart. Not because they immediately appeared criminal. Because they appeared medically puzzling. Some infants seemed to be progressing encouragingly before suffering sudden, unexpected collapses. Doctors who had anticipated continued improvement instead found themselves rushing into emergency interventions. Parents who had begun imagining discharge suddenly watched resuscitation teams surround their child's incubator. The emotional violence of those moments is difficult to capture. 1 minute, a mother may be discussing tomorrow's feeding schedule. The next, she is asked to step outside while clinicians fight to save her baby's life. Time behaves strangely during emergencies. Seconds stretch endlessly. Every opening of the door feels significant. Every unfamiliar face entering the room raises new fears. Parents search the expressions of doctors for reassurance that often cannot yet be honestly given. Many describe waiting as the hardest part. Not knowing. Unable to help. Forced to stand still while strangers do everything within their power. Some emergencies end with relief. The baby's condition stabilizes. The monitors return to more reassuring rhythms. Exhausted staff members exchange brief nods before quietly preparing for the next patient requiring attention. Families cry with gratitude. Life continues. Other emergencies end in silence. Equipment is switched off. Gloves are removed slowly. Someone guides devastated parents into a private room away from the clinical bustle of the ward. There are no perfect words in such moments. Healthcare professionals know this. Training can teach clinical skills. Experience teaches humility before grief. Every family responds differently. Some ask endless questions. Some cannot speak at all. Some remain astonishingly calm until hours later, when the reality finally becomes impossible to hold back. Each response is deeply personal. Each deserves compassion. As months passed, more families found themselves joining the painful community of parents whose babies had experienced unexpected and devastating collapses. They did not know one another. Most never met. Their stories unfolded on different days, under different circumstances. Yet years later, they would become connected through an investigation none of them could have imagined. During those early days, however, there was only individual grief. One family mourning one child. Another family hoping desperately for recovery after a frightening collapse. Another trying to understand medical explanations while struggling to absorb unbearable news. No one could yet see the broader picture. Not the parents. Not the public. Even among hospital staff, the emerging concerns remained fragmented. One consultant remembered an unusual deterioration. Another recalled a case that resisted straightforward medical explanation. Individually, such memories remained just that. Memories. Only later would investigators begin arranging them into timelines, comparing clinical records, and asking whether separate tragedies might somehow be connected. For the families, those future investigations lay beyond imagination. Their world had become painfully simple. They wanted answers. They wanted honesty. Most of all, they wanted the impossible. They wanted their children back. That desire transcends every legal argument that would later emerge. Whether discussing prosecution evidence, defense challenges, expert testimony, or public controversy, it is impossible to forget the human reality at the center of this case. These were not abstract legal files. They were babies whose parents had already imagined entire lifetimes together. Some nurseries remained fully prepared long after they were no longer needed. Tiny clothes stayed folded inside drawers. Unopened gifts waited in corners of bedrooms. Hospital identification bracelets became treasured possessions because they were among the few physical reminders of lives that had ended almost before they had begun. Grief after neonatal loss carries a unique cruelty. Parents mourn not only the child they knew but also the countless experiences that will never happen. The first smile. The first birthday. The first day at school. Every imagined milestone disappears at once. Friends and relatives often struggle to know what to say. There are no traditions that adequately prepare people for comforting parents whose child lived only days or weeks. Many families later spoke about feeling isolated, caught between overwhelming grief and a world that seemed to continue moving as though nothing had changed. Yet even within that grief, they remembered acts of kindness. Healthcare workers who cried alongside them. Staff who created memory boxes containing tiny footprints, photographs, blankets, or handprints. Volunteers who quietly supported bereavement services. These gestures could never erase loss, but they acknowledged something profoundly important. Every baby's life mattered. No matter how brief. No matter how fragile. No matter how few days they spent in the world. That understanding forms the emotional foundation of this entire story. Before investigators assembled evidence, before lawyers argued competing interpretations, before the public encountered headlines that would spark years of debate, there were simply families whose greatest wish was to carry their children home. Some would eventually do exactly that. Others never had the chance. Their stories deserve to be remembered not because they became part of a famous criminal case, but because they began as something infinitely more important, the ordinary, universal story of parents loving their children with every hope they possessed. For many people watching the Lucy Letby case from a distance, the names, dates, medical terminology, and courtroom arguments became the focus. The public discussion often centered on evidence, timelines, expert opinions, and legal conclusions. But behind every page of evidence was a family. Behind every medical record was a child. Behind every courtroom reference was a moment that changed someone's life forever. The babies at the center of this case did not enter the world as symbols of a legal debate. They entered the world as sons and daughters. They arrived carrying the hopes of parents who had spent months imagining a future that, in some cases, would never come. Their stories began long before the first emergency alarm sounded. They began with anticipation. A positive pregnancy test. A first ultrasound image. A heartbeat heard during a routine appointment. A conversation about names. A family wondering whether the baby would inherit a mother's smile or a father's personality. Those moments are shared by millions of parents around the world. They are ordinary moments, yet they represent one of the most powerful forms of hope humans experience. The arrival of a child represents the belief that the future will continue. Parents imagine a person they have not yet met. They imagine conversations they have not yet had. They imagine memories that do not exist yet. That imagined future begins long before birth. When a baby is born prematurely, that future suddenly becomes uncertain. The focus shifts from dreams to survival. Instead of choosing colors for a nursery, parents learn the layout of a hospital ward. Instead of attending parenting classes, they attend medical briefings. Instead of asking when they can leave the hospital, they ask whether their baby will make it through the night. The emotional transformation happens quickly. A parent who expected to experience the first hours of life holding their newborn may instead find themselves standing beside a machine, afraid to touch their own child without permission. They are forced to understand a heartbreaking contradiction. Their baby is alive. Their baby is fighting. But their baby is also incredibly fragile. The neonatal unit becomes a place where joy and fear exist together. A baby's eyes opening for the first time can bring tears of happiness. A sudden change in breathing can create immediate panic. A nurse saying everything looks okay can feel like the greatest gift in the world. Parents learn to appreciate moments that others might overlook. A stronger cry. A better feeding. A few more minutes of peaceful sleep. A small movement of a tiny hand. Every improvement matters because every improvement represents possibility. That possibility was what kept families returning day after day. Even when exhausted. Even when frightened. Even when the uncertainty became overwhelming. They returned because their children were there. The relationship between parents and babies in neonatal care is unlike almost any other beginning to parenthood. Many parents are unable to perform the everyday actions they imagined. They cannot always pick their child up when crying. They cannot always feed them. They cannot always hold them whenever they want. Instead, they learn different forms of connection. A hand placed gently against an incubator. A quiet voice speaking through layers of medical equipment. A song repeated every day. A photograph taken because today might become a memory they will treasure forever. These acts may appear small. To the parents, they are everything. For the nurses working in the unit, these relationships became part of daily life. They watched families experience the highest moments of hope and the deepest moments of fear. They witnessed parents transform from frightened visitors into confident caregivers. They saw babies who once appeared impossibly fragile grow stronger. Those successes were powerful reminders of why neonatal medicine existed. Every discharge represented a victory. A baby leaving the unit in a car seat for the first time. A family finally walking through the hospital doors together. A journey that had begun surrounded by machines ending with the ordinary sound of a newborn crying in the back seat of a car. Those moments were celebrated. But neonatal medicine also contains moments that cannot be repaired. Some babies, despite extraordinary medical efforts, do not survive. This reality was understood by every person working in the unit. Death was not a failure automatically. Medicine has limits. Premature bodies can face challenges too severe for even the most advanced care to overcome. For staff members, accepting that reality is part of the profession. For parents, it is a life-changing wound. A healthcare worker may understand the medical explanation. A parent understands only that their child is gone. That difference is impossible to bridge completely. In the months and years following the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital, families would find themselves connected by a shared experience of loss and by a search for understanding. Some wanted answers about why their children had deteriorated so suddenly. Some wanted accountability. Some simply wanted their babies remembered as more than names appearing in a criminal case. Their grief existed before the investigation. It existed before the media attention. It existed before the courtroom. And it continued long after the verdicts were announced. The public often looks for a single defining moment in stories like this. The moment everything changed. The moment suspicion began. The moment investigators arrived. But for the families, the defining moments were much more personal. The first time they saw their baby. The first time they touched their baby. The last time they held their baby. The phone call they never wanted to receive. The room where they heard words they would remember forever. Those moments do not appear as headlines. They do not fit easily into legal documents. Yet they are the true foundation of the story. Because crime investigations are ultimately about people. Not statistics. Not timelines. Not evidence alone. People. The babies involved in this case were among the most vulnerable human beings imaginable. They entered life requiring protection from everyone around them. Their parents trusted medical professionals because trust is the only choice available when a child is critically ill. That trust is one of the central themes of this case. It explains why the allegations were so shocking. It explains why the investigation became so important. It explains why the trial received such intense public attention. The idea that someone responsible for protecting fragile newborn lives could instead be accused of harming them challenged one of society's deepest assumptions. Hospitals are supposed to represent safety. Nurses are supposed to represent care. The relationship between them is built upon confidence. When that confidence is questioned, the emotional impact extends far beyond a single courtroom. However, the lives of these children should not be remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths or the legal proceedings that followed. They were more than victims in a case file. They were children who had names chosen with love. Children whose families celebrated their arrival. Children who, even in a short time, changed the lives of everyone who loved them. A life is not measured only by length. A baby who lived for days can leave a lifetime of memories behind. A baby who spent weeks inside an incubator can create a bond that never disappears. A child who never came home can still remain part of a family forever. That is perhaps the most important thing to remember before moving deeper into the events that followed. Before there was an investigation, there was love. Before there were accusations, there were hopes. Before there were courtroom arguments, there were parents standing beside hospital beds, believing with all their hearts that tomorrow would bring better news. And that hope, the hope of ordinary families placed into extraordinary circumstances, is where the human story of the Lucy Letby case truly begins. Inside a neonatal intensive care unit, emergencies rarely announce themselves. There is no dramatic warning. No obvious sign that a moment will become the moment a family remembers forever. A shift begins like any other. A nurse reviews notes from the previous team. A doctor examines laboratory results. Parents arrive carrying coffee, bags, and the fragile optimism they have learned to protect. A baby sleeps beneath a blanket. A monitor displays steady numbers. Then something changes. A number drops. A rhythm shifts. An alarm breaks through the familiar background noise. And suddenly, an ordinary moment becomes a fight against time. This was the environment in which the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital unfolded between 2015 and 2016. The babies involved were already among the most vulnerable patients in medicine. Many had entered the world earlier than expected, their bodies still developing, their survival dependent upon technology, medication, and the constant attention of skilled professionals. Every day carried uncertainty. A premature infant could appear stable and then deteriorate quickly. A condition that seemed controlled could suddenly worsen. Doctors and nurses working in neonatal care understood this reality better than anyone. That understanding shaped their first responses. When a baby collapsed, the first thought was not crime. The first thought was medicine. What has changed? What is happening inside this child's body? What can we do right now? The response was immediate. Staff moved toward the incubator. Emergency procedures began. Equipment was checked. Medications were prepared. Every person in the room focused on one goal: keeping the baby alive. For parents watching these moments, time became almost impossible to understand. A few minutes could feel endless. The sound of alarms could become something permanently remembered. The sight of doctors and nurses gathering around their child could create a fear unlike anything they had experienced before. Many parents describe these moments as surreal. The room continues moving, but they feel frozen. People are speaking, but words become difficult to process. They recognize expressions more than sentences. A calm face brings hope. A serious expression creates terror. For medical staff, however, there is no time to process emotion. Training takes over. Years of experience guide every movement. Someone manages the airway. Someone checks vital signs. Someone records what is happening. Someone communicates with the wider medical team. The response is organized because chaos cannot be allowed to control an emergency. But even the best medical teams cannot save every patient. Sometimes, despite every intervention, the outcome is devastating. A baby does not recover. A family receives the news they were desperately hoping never to hear. The hospital becomes a place of unbearable silence. A room prepared for celebration becomes a place of grief. This was the reality faced by multiple families connected to the later investigation into Lucy Letby. The prosecution's case argued that these events were not simply tragic medical outcomes. Prosecutors alleged that Letby deliberately harmed infants under her care through various methods, including injecting air, interfering with feeding, and administering insulin. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued that the deaths and collapses occurred among extremely vulnerable babies whose medical conditions alone could explain many of the events. They argued that there was no direct eyewitness evidence, no physical evidence such as DNA linking Letby to criminal acts, and that the prosecution's conclusions relied heavily on interpretation of complex medical circumstances. At the center of this disagreement was a question that would define the entire trial. Were these tragedies the result of natural medical complications, or were they deliberate acts hidden inside the uncertainty of neonatal care? That question did not emerge immediately. At first, each incident existed separately. Each baby had an individual medical history. Each collapse had its own circumstances. Each emergency had its own explanation that doctors attempted to understand. Hospitals are accustomed to unexpected outcomes. They are places where things go wrong despite careful planning. A premature baby's condition can change because of infection. A fragile respiratory system can suddenly fail. A body that has fought for weeks can eventually become overwhelmed. The challenge for doctors is knowing when an event is an unfortunate complication and when it represents something unusual. That distinction is one of the hardest problems in medicine. Because rare things happen. A coincidence can look like a pattern. A pattern can be mistaken for coincidence. The early incidents in the neonatal unit existed within that uncertainty. The babies were not healthy children suddenly appearing in a hospital. They were already critically ill. Their survival was never guaranteed. This fact would become one of the central arguments throughout the legal proceedings. The defense emphasized the vulnerability of the infants and the complexity of neonatal medicine. They argued that the prosecution's interpretation underestimated how unpredictable these cases could be. The prosecution, however, argued that the number, timing, and circumstances of the collapses were impossible to ignore. They presented a picture of repeated events occurring in a specific environment, often during periods when Letby was present. According to prosecutors, the pattern was too unusual to be explained by chance. The difference between those two perspectives would eventually be placed before a jury. But before there was a courtroom, there was a hospital staff trying to understand what they were witnessing. Doctors began discussing cases more closely. They compared experiences. They reviewed what had happened. At first, these conversations were not about accusing anyone. They were about finding answers. Medical professionals are trained to investigate problems. When outcomes do not match expectations, they search for explanations. That process is fundamental to improving patient care. But in this situation, the questions gradually became more difficult. Why were some babies deteriorating after appearing relatively stable? Why were certain incidents occurring in similar circumstances? Why did experienced clinicians feel that something about the situation was unusual? These questions created discomfort because they led toward possibilities nobody wanted to consider. The idea that a person working inside the unit could intentionally harm patients was almost unimaginable. Hospitals depend upon teamwork. The person standing beside the incubator is supposed to be the person protecting the child. The person administering care is supposed to represent safety. To question that assumption means questioning the foundation of the entire environment. That is why suspicion, when it eventually emerged, developed slowly. Not because people did not care, but because the accusation itself was so extraordinary. Every alternative explanation had to be considered. Every possibility had to be examined. Every conclusion had to be supported. Meanwhile, families continued living through the aftermath of each incident. For those who lost children, there was no return to normal. The world outside continued. Cars continued driving through Chester. Shops continued opening each morning. People continued planning weekends and holidays. But for grieving parents, time stopped at the moment they lost their child. The investigation that would eventually follow was not simply about statistics or medical records. It was about understanding how those moments happened. Moments when a baby who had been alive minutes earlier suddenly entered a medical emergency. Moments when parents watched professionals fight for their child's survival. Moments when hope disappeared. The question that remained was whether those moments represented the heartbreaking unpredictability of premature birth or something far more disturbing. That uncertainty would become the driving force behind everything that followed. Because in a case where there was no single dramatic crime scene, no obvious weapon, and no simple explanation, Investigators had to reconstruct the truth from thousands of small pieces. And those pieces began with the moments when the monitors changed, the alarm sounded, and the fragile lives inside the neonatal unit were suddenly placed in danger. The most difficult moments in a neonatal unit are not always the loudest. Sometimes they begin quietly. A nurse notices a change that seems almost too small to mention. A baby who was moving differently. A monitor displaying a number slightly outside the expected range. A feeding that was not tolerated as well as before. In neonatal medicine, small details matter because premature babies often cannot communicate distress in any other way. They cannot cry out like older children. They cannot point to where something hurts. Their bodies speak through subtle signs, and the people caring for them must learn how to listen. That responsibility creates a unique relationship between nurses and their patients. A nurse may spend hours beside the same incubator, watching patterns that others might miss. How a baby usually sleeps. How often they move. How they respond to touch. How their breathing changes during care. These observations become part of clinical judgment. They are not written as dramatic discoveries. They are simply part of everyday work. Which is why sudden deterioration can be so frightening. A baby who has shown encouraging signs of progress can appear to change without warning. The medical team reacts immediately, but the emotional shock remains. Parents often remember those moments with painful clarity. The room that had felt calm only moments earlier suddenly becomes unfamiliar. The people who had offered reassurance are now moving quickly and speaking in urgent voices. A parent standing beside the incubator may understand only one thing. Something is wrong. During the period covered by the Lucy Letby case, several such emergencies occurred at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The infants involved were medically fragile. Some had been born prematurely. Some had complex health challenges from birth. Their conditions meant that sudden complications were always possible. That reality made the investigation exceptionally difficult. The central question was not simply whether babies had died or collapsed. Everyone agreed that they had. The question was why. What caused those events? Could they be explained by the known risks associated with neonatal intensive care? Or did they reveal something else happening inside the unit? The prosecution would later argue that the incidents shared similarities that could not reasonably be ignored. They pointed to the timing of collapses, the presence of Letby during many of the events, and medical findings that they argued suggested deliberate interference. They described a pattern in which infants who were vulnerable but stable experienced sudden and unexpected deterioration. The defense offered a different explanation. They argued that the babies were among the most medically complex patients in the hospital. They emphasized that premature infants can deteriorate rapidly even with appropriate care and that unusual outcomes do not automatically indicate criminal behavior. They also challenged some of the medical interpretations presented by the prosecution, arguing that certain conclusions relied on assumptions rather than direct proof. This disagreement became the foundation of the case. But behind every argument were individual moments involving individual families. Consider what an emergency looks like from the perspective of a parent. A mother who has spent weeks learning the rhythm of her baby's care. She knows the nurses. She knows the doctors. She knows which monitor belongs to which number. She has finally begun allowing herself to believe that her child might come home. Then suddenly, the atmosphere changes. The baby who had been resting quietly begins struggling. Staff arrive quickly. The incubator doors open. A team gathers. The parent steps backward because there is no space for them anymore. They watch. They wait. They pray. In those minutes, a hospital becomes a place suspended between hope and fear. The parent is surrounded by experts but feels completely powerless. They cannot fix what is happening. They cannot take away their child's pain. They can only stand nearby and trust. That dependence on trust is one of the reasons this case affected so many people. A hospital is built upon vulnerability. Patients and families surrender control because they believe the people caring for them are committed to protecting them. The allegations against Letby were therefore shocking not only because of the crimes alleged, but because of where they were said to have occurred. A place designed for healing. A place where parents believed their children were safest. A place where trust was supposed to be absolute. As investigators later examined the events, they looked beyond individual emergencies. They studied the wider environment. They reviewed staffing patterns. They examined medical documentation. They considered whether there were common factors connecting the cases. One of the important elements they considered was the apparent increase in serious incidents during a particular period. The hospital had experienced a number of unexpected collapses and deaths among newborns, prompting concerns from some clinicians. However, understanding whether a number of tragedies represents a meaningful pattern requires careful analysis. In medicine and statistics, unusual events can occur by chance. A cluster does not automatically prove a cause. Experts must ask whether the frequency, timing, and circumstances are genuinely outside what would normally be expected. This distinction would become a major point of debate after the trial. Supporters of the prosecution viewed the accumulation of incidents as evidence of deliberate actions. Critics questioned whether some interpretations gave too much weight to patterns without enough consideration of alternative explanations. The complexity came from the nature of neonatal care itself. A neonatal unit is already a place where serious medical events happen. The patients are already at high risk. The line between expected complications and extraordinary events can sometimes be extremely difficult to define. That is why doctors rely on investigation. They do not simply accept unusual outcomes. They examine them. They ask questions. They search for answers. And sometimes those answers lead to painful conclusions. The first signs of concern among clinicians did not appear as a single dramatic revelation. There was no moment when someone suddenly understood everything. Instead, concern developed gradually. A feeling that certain events required another look. A sense that some explanations did not fully satisfy experienced professionals. A growing awareness that the usual assumptions might not explain everything they were seeing. Inside the hospital, those concerns created tension. Healthcare teams are communities built on cooperation. Questioning a colleague is not a simple act. It can feel like a betrayal. Especially when the person being questioned is someone you have worked beside, someone you have shared difficult shifts with, someone you have trusted. That emotional conflict would become one of the most important human elements of the case. Because investigations are not only about facts. They are also about people forced into impossible situations. Doctors who had to decide whether speaking up was necessary. Managers who had to weigh competing responsibilities. Colleagues who later had to reconsider years of ordinary interactions. Families who had to revisit painful memories through the lens of suspicion. The incidents inside the neonatal unit created a chain of consequences that extended far beyond the original emergencies. Every decision afterward mattered. Every conversation mattered. Every delay or action carried weight. But before there was a police investigation, before there were arrests and court hearings, there was simply a group of medical professionals trying to understand a disturbing question. Why were these babies suddenly collapsing? And why did some of those moments feel different from the tragedies they had witnessed before? The search for that answer would transform a hospital concern into a national investigation. The quiet alarms of a neonatal ward would eventually become the evidence examined in one of Britain's most complex criminal trials. But at the beginning, there were only those fragile moments. A monitor changing. A team rushing. A family waiting. A question no one wanted to ask. And the desperate hope that somewhere within the medical records, the answer could be found.